Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on which time zone you're in. My name is Karen Anderson. I am Associate Professor of Social Policy at University College Dublin, and I have the pleasure of chairing this webinar on inequality and social policy, focusing on Asia, East Asia. I am the incoming chair or chair-elect of the Council for European Studies. We have a really excellent slate of speakers and an excellent moderator coming up. So I will just introduce the webinar to you. This is the third one in our CES Insights series. So first, let me tell you the order of speakers and who they are, and a little bit about our moderator. So we have three absolutely excellent speakers who I'm sure you are familiar with. The first one will be Margarita Estévez-Abe, who is a professor at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. So she is joining us, I believe, from New York. So thanks for getting up early. Our second speaker is Professor Junko Kato, who is a professor of political science at the University of Tokyo, and she's joining us from Tokyo, so it's evening or late evening, so thanks for staying up. And then our third speaker is Jong-Sung You, who is a professor of social policy at Gashon University in Korea. He's also, it's late evening also for him. He's joining us from Korea. And finally, our moderator is Professor Julian Garritzmann, who is at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, and he will be moderating the discussion today. So let me just, and he's joining us from Germany, so, so he's in a comfortable time zone, as am I. So let me tell you a little bit about the schedule or how we're going to do things. If you're not familiar with the Q&A function in Zoom, you'll see a little button at the bottom right of your screen, and that's what we'll be using for Q&A. So the three speakers will speak in order, and then Julian will come on and moderate the discussion. You're free to type questions in the Q&A during the presentations or once the Q&A starts, and Julian will tell you a little bit more. He'll remind you a little bit more about that when we start the discussion. So I'm really, really excited to hear the presentations by our three speakers. I know all of your work, or I've seen you at conferences, met you at conferences. So I'm excited, and I hope everybody out there listening and watching is excited too. So I'll give the floor to Margarita Estévez-Abe now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karen and Julian, for having me here. Let me just share my slide.
Sorry, Margarita, before you start, maybe I should say a few words.
Sure.
Sorry, sorry for interrupting.
Yes, go ahead.
Just for the audience to understand. So I asked the panelists a couple of questions. Maybe we should highlight it first before three of you start. So just to maybe set the scene quickly before I turn it over. But first I want to say thanks a lot for Karen for the nice introduction, and CES and the Korea Inequality Research Lab for hosting us. Just to set the scene, so we are talking about inequality both in Europe and in East Asia. And I guess many of you have seen graphs like this of rising inequality, both in the US, in Europe, and in East Asia. At the same time, we have quite big differences still between countries. We also know by now that if we look at this more in the long term, we have this big U-shape pattern, that inequality is going up back to the levels where it has been at the early century, both in terms of income inequality and wealth inequality. At the same time, we know that poverty is declining, especially in East Asia and the Pacific region. But of course, we can also look at other forms of inequality, such as gender inequality. And some rough measure here showing that over time, the countries are becoming more equal in terms of gender, but still quite big differences exist. And finally, of course, there are big rural differences, especially in terms of education, that some people have a much higher likelihood to participate in education than others. There are still many other forms of inequality in terms of life expectancy and so on. So what we did with the panelists was that we set a range of themes and trying to discuss a bit what the causes are and some of the consequences of inequality and what can be done about this. And so I asked them basically three big questions. The first one is, what do you see as the major reason for rising inequality in both Europe and Asia? Then second, what actually do you think is the most important form of inequality? Because there are so many, it's a multidimensional phenomenon. And then last, what do you think can be done? So is there a one-size-fits-all solution to inequality in both regions? Which type of inequality is economically, socially, and politically feasible? And all three speakers will address some of these topics. Of course, it's basically impossible to answer all of these topics and answer all of these questions in a couple of minutes. So they will highlight different aspects. And we'll start with Margarita. And sorry for having interrupted you at the beginning, just to basically set the scene and give everyone the same context.
Okay, so let me just reshare. Okay, as a sort of brief introduction, self-introduction, I have just worked on gender sort of segregation, sort of gender inequality issues. But just right now, I'm interested in the political economy of demographic aging. This actually just overlaps a lot with my interest in gender equality or inequality, but also just goes beyond that. And also just ever since this sort of pandemic has affected us, I have also just been looking into how sort of different countries have fared in protecting their elderly, which is the segment of the population that's rapidly increasing in advanced industrial societies, and particularly sort of increasing rapidly in Asian countries, Japan being the most aged society. So what I'm going to do in my just brief presentation is to just touch on the importance of sort of demographic aging in sort of thinking about inequality. But I just want to just start talking about sort of inequality just more broadly. Let's see. So why do we just care about inequality? Sort of Julian has just shown. So inequality. So when we just look at sort of global inequality, so this has been decreasing, and just people like Francisco Ferreira has been just making has done just a lot of interesting studies on this. So despite the fact that the inequality is decreasing globally, especially when we just focus the inequality between countries, within country inequality has been rising in some wealthy countries. And so Ferreira makes a very sort of important sort of point that whatever happens in the United States just tends to dominate the academic discourse, which is that the United States is a highly inegalitarian country and has sort of lots of problems. So just similar things have happened in a subset of other advanced industrial societies, but not in all of them. But there is this sort of sense that just, something is just going, something is not going well in advanced industrial societies, and just people have just talked about job polarization, whether it's happening, whether the middle class is sort of shrinking, and all these sort of interests just seem to be just related to, well, at least for those of us who are political scientists, with the sort of notion that somehow social solidarity is breaking down. And also this has just something to do with the increase in the mistrust of the government or the rise of sort of extremist parties. So this inequality and how the types in which, just the ways in which the rising inequality or the change in the economic structure is affecting people. Just we are interested in this because we just think that ultimately this might affect the present and the future of liberal sort of democracy. So keywords here are also like globalization, technological advancement. So job polarization, people who look into job polarization oftentimes just look into the impact of technology. So technology just makes certain occupations obsolete. And so unless the population is capable of upscaling, those who just failed in upscaling will just fall below the middle class and will just fall into the lower class. And so basically upskilling becomes a requirement for the maintenance of the middle class. So many people have just realized that this sort of technology, that doesn't mean polarization within the occupational, in the labor market, but it kind of changes the who can be in the middle class. And so in advanced industrial societies, so there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the upskilling is necessary to sort of maintain the size of the middle class. One thing that's just not mentioned that often is the impact of demography. So most studies that look into job polarization look into the role of technology mostly, and just somewhat globalization as manufacturing jobs have sort of migrated elsewhere. But as I just see it, there's been just relatively little sort of discussion on the role of demography in thinking about sort of inequality or the changes that's happening in our sort of labor markets. Just to give you an idea of the impact of demography, Japan is, again, as I mentioned, is the most aged society in the world. The second is Italy. In Finland, Germany, all just very aged societies. So just to give you an example of how aged sort of Japan is, more than 9% of the Japanese population are above the age of 80. More than 9% is above the age of 80. In Germany, this number is around 7%. In Italy too, so roughly Germany and Italy are just similar. The US is in a very different situation. The US is aging too, but the percentage of those older than 80 years old in the US would be just less than 4%, around 3.5. So when we just think about the comparison of sort of inequality in sort of Europe and Japan or East Asia, we really do need to just sort of focus on the impact of demographic aging. So there are sort of varieties of inequality in wealthy countries too, that we can't just really just go over all of them. And as many people just use all kinds of sort of different data. Just some people just look into earnings differentials. Some people just look into individual earnings or household income. And there are sort of differences in terms of pre-tax transfer versus post-tax transfer inequalities. Many scholars who use the data set from Luxembourg income study, because that data set is just much better in just looking into post-tax transfer data. So it's a great data set for net income rather than gross. So many people just already, when they just look into the patterns of inequality, they're already taking into account the impact of tax and sort of transfers. Whereas so inequalities might be rising from the market, And also inequality might be rising, or in terms of sort of changes in the social policies and sort of tax policies. But these things are not the only things that affect inequalities. Gender inequality, racial inequality. So these are just impacted by sort of discrimination. So not just these market-based sort of factors, but there are sort of human intervention in discriminating against certain sort of groups of people. So inequality between natives and migrants, or people of migrant origin. So inequality in old age, there might be just some ageism in the sort of labor market, but inequality in old age could also just mean just accumulation of the inequalities that piled up during one's life course. Now with the demographic aging, generational inequality is a big issue too, because smaller and smaller number of working age people now have to support the ever increasing number of pensioners who also just consume a lot of healthcare. And also we are just in sort of liberal democracies, the family patterns are rapidly changing. So there might be inequality across sort of family types. And also the change in the economic structure and the sort of social structure might be also just enhancing types of inequality or opportunity. But in all of this, we cannot say that there is a universal trend in all across sort of wealthy sort of democracies, that the pattern of inequalities is quite different. And so the highlight here is that the public policy and institutional differences really matter. So some countries are faring better than others. So whenever we just talk about inequality, just oftentimes, so Nordic countries just come out as the country. So Nordic countries always just do better than others in containing most types of inequalities. And out of this, as sort of European scholars would just be very familiar with, the concept of social investment strategy has emerged as an all-purpose way of dealing with problems of advanced industrial societies. Many of the OECD reports on the struggling middle classes or the worsening of social mobility. So all these OECD reports, they all sort of recommend some forms of social investment strategy, even when they do not sort of use the term. So I'm just running out of time, but so one thing that I just want to sort of highlight is that, so is this a solution that works for everyone? Like, for instance, a country like Japan, or did the Nordic countries just get lucky? So once demographic aging just reaches a certain threshold, it really starts to affect the economic conditions of the country. It just changes the occupational structure. It changes the demand structure and diminishes the demand. And just to give you a sort of rough idea of what demographic aging does to the labor market. So right now in Japan, there are 2 million care workers. And the demand for these care workers will further increase. In Germany right now, there's 1.2 million care workers. They too will just need more care workers. So can we just continue to just pay well to these care workers? So it is just already known that these care workers, even when they're highly skilled, do not get paid as well as workers with equivalent skills in the healthcare sector. And so there are sort of differences across countries, but this sort of care sector is heavily subsidized by the government in almost in all countries, even including the United States, which means that it's very difficult to raise the wages of these sort of workers. So it's not just sort of technological change, it's not just sort of globalization, but there is this sort of impact of demographic aging that's affecting the occupational sector and also the macroeconomic condition of the country in itself. So what is happening then, that the pie gets smaller and smaller, and intergenerational sort of burden, sort of differentials in sort of burdening the cost of the system and also the economic opportunities that different generations have. All these things just start to change. So Japan is, in a sense, in the vanguard of this change. And probably sort of other sort of European sort of countries will follow too, and whether Nordic model can sort of inform these countries of how to get out of this. I'm sort of very pessimistic of how social investment strategy might work for countries that have already just gone past a certain threshold of demographic aging. So I won't just have time to go through this, but so I've been just doing some study about the effect of the current pandemic, and this pandemic has been just very interesting in the sense that it really just highlights some of the problems that we are seeing in the varieties of us inequalities. So this pandemic really just highlighted just all of the things that affect inequalities, just globalization, demographic aging, technological divide, how different classes of people, how different sort of family types, and whether men and women have fared in this crisis. And also, this crisis has really shown that, again, public policy matters and institutional foundations of different countries matter. So countries that didn't have good long-term care systems, where there was little social solidarity or public intervention in long-term care insurance, those countries actually have seen the most number of nursing home sort of residents die of the disease. Whereas just countries that had more robust systems have been able to just contain the number of deaths in sort of nursing homes. Just some countries just have been just able to offer more assistance to working parents throughout the pandemic, whereas some countries haven't been just able to do. So I just want to say that yes, the inequality might be just rising in advanced industrial societies, but there are so many types of inequalities, and different public policies just affect them. But public policies just seem to work in containing some inequalities. And this doesn't mean that we always just have to look to the Nordic countries. But so it's a sort of mixed message of, well, there might not be all-purpose solution to solve all inequalities, but we nonetheless can just learn about some sort of best practices and just think about whether the best practices in other countries just might fit the kind of institutional foundations that particular countries already have. Thank you so much. Let me just end here, and I'll just take more questions if there are any later.
Thank you so much, Margarita. Maybe we'll join you in kind of thanking you virtually. We'll turn it over to Junko Kato. And as Karen said at the beginning, you are very much invited anytime to ask questions in the chat. And after all three presentations, we'll try to address as many questions as we can. So just keep posting questions, we'll save them. But first, Junko Kato, thanks again for joining us. I think you're still on mute. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I will approach the problem of inequality by focusing on tax policy since tax policy affects not only income redistribution, but also revenue raising for all the kind of public expenditure. So this is my starting point. More specifically, I will argue that party governments are required to choose policies from existing tax alternatives that are not necessarily consistent with their policy positions. So this presentation is built on the argument in my previous works in taxation. So let me start from the little bit technical part of the tax policy. Tax policy are distinguished by three different principles: equity, neutrality, and simplicity. Equity is a principle for redistribution, and thus is achieved if a tax policy results in more income equality. Neutrality means the extent to which taxation does not interfere with economic activity. Simplicity represents how simple the system of tax administration is. And no tax satisfies all three principles. So that's a problem. Income tax is strong in equity since it is able to apply progressive tax rate, but is weak in neutrality, so interferes with economic activity. General consumption tax, such as the value-added tax, is weak in equity because of flat regressive rate, but strong in neutrality if consistently implemented. So these taxes are different in their revenue raising power. When compared with the tax on income, a general consumption tax, especially the value-added tax, is much more effective in raising revenue. So contemporary governments are unable to design tax system as they like. So this is what many political scientists are not very much conscious of. They need to choose from several, and party government need to choose from several alternatives that can be implemented. So for example, corporate income tax and also personal income taxes, the general consumption tax, such as the value-added tax, are major revenue sources. So cross-national variation has been observed in tax level and also in tax revenue structure compared with the size of the national economy, for example, as a proportion of gross domestic product. So actually, this is a very, very rough figure, but I'd like to give you some idea about the relationship between the tax policy and equality. This figure shows tax levels and revenue structure of 28 countries from the OECD statistic to include countries from Asia and Europe. If countries are listed in the order of redistributive inequality, so actually by Gini coefficient here, a clear tendency has been found that more equal countries are more likely to have high tax level. Of course, there are some exceptions. In other words, if government want to promote equality in society, they tend to increase tax level because it is quite rare to decrease inequality with low tax level. So this is some kind of constraint. So of course, this association of higher tax level and more equality in the same country may be a spurious correlation, but actually there is some political logic or political dynamics in which higher income equality requires government to secure high tax revenue to finance high expenditure for redistribution. So it is obvious that a direct transfer from the rich to the poor is the most efficient form of redistribution, more specifically, taxing the rich heavily and targeting the benefit to the poor. However, this is unlikely to obtain a majority support for redistribution. Support and opposition are split between the poor and the rich, while middle income classes are indifferently So the Margarita already emphasized the importance of the middle income class. Based on the median voter theorem, political economists find that redistributive equality is supported by a majority only when the median voter's income is lower than the mean income. So universalism more likely wins the support from the middle income class for a majority to form a majority because of provision of benefit across income classes. However, universalism is inefficient since protection covers all the population that are neither the poor nor the needy. This results in high expenditure. So government does need to raise more tax revenue to finance high expenditure for universal provision. So this is a kind of the contradiction that is imposed on party government. So let me summarize the relationship between party position and tax policy in two dimensions. The first dimension is the size of government, its financial capacity. That is a big government on the left side and small government on the right side. The second dimension here, distinguish tax in redistribution and thus distinguishes progressive and regressive taxes, which are supported by the left and right party respectively. Okay, the right and the conservative party prefer small government and regressive tax that is against redistribution but neutral to economic activity. And the leftist party preferred just the opposite, a big government and a progressive tax. If plotted in two dimensions, neither income tax nor consumption taxes, value-added tax, are preferred by party. So they're just the opposite. Okay. Income tax is progressive, but has a weak revenue raising power, so resulting only a small government. So value-added tax. So among the value-added tax, among the general consumption tax, the value-added tax has the strongest revenue raising power, is regressive, but again has a strong revenue raising power and neutral to economic activity, and it is consistent with the big government. So this means that the party government are required to adjust to the existing constraint of tax policy. So if I plot the country in terms of their response to the constraint, social democratic welfare state, the Nordic and Scandinavian country, have tried income redistribution through public expenditure while raising revenue also from regressive tax. So this is actually contradictory with their ideological position. Conservative welfare states, such as the continental European country, have also relied on regressive tax to finance high expenditure. However, in these countries, left party are not comfortable with this situation and oppose regressive tax, in contrast with social democratic party in the Scandinavian country. So in this regard, I think social democratic country, welfare state, have fully accepted and responded to the constraint from taxation. So now we have observed the shift to the social investment policy, but actually, as Margarita explained, actually these policy also require high expenditure. So this means that their response to the constraint from tax policy, I think it means a lot for their adjustment to the new situation. So liberal welfare state, such as the US and the Canada and also the Australia and Switzerland, rely on progressive income tax and to finance a small government. And Japan is somewhere in between because Japan now has a very high level of deficit. And the East Asian and the Latin American country are more likely found in the quadrant of a small government and regressive tax, regardless of the partisanship of their governments. These countries are latecomer. Thus, they have introduced modern tax system since the 1970s, when mature democracy had already encountered the problem of budget deficit and the revenue shortfall of income tax. Therefore, these countries rely for their revenue on regressive tax, such as the VAT, but still fall short of raising high revenue, especially compared with mature democracy, since their income tax is still weak and less comprehensive. So let me conclude this presentation by summarizing my argument. Party government actually are unable to choose tax policy that are actually best for their position. Tax constraints explain one of the important reasons why party governments are unable to advance equality as they desire or intend in redistribution. Mature and young democracy face the same constraint, actually in different ways. In mature democracy, the left party need to raise higher revenue need to raise higher revenue using regressive taxes. And the right and the conservative party tend to rely more on income tax to avoid a big government. So here, some kind of the contradiction for the party government, inconsistent choice of tax policy, if considering the ideological position. In young democracy, party government face the difficulty to institutionalize tax system that raise comparable level of revenue with those of mature democracy. And more important, all democracies have now shared an increasing constraint from globalization. The governments are unable to impose more tax on the population, the business and the people because of economic competition and also tax competition between the government. This further increases tax constraint. So in conclusion, I think the state financial capacity affects all policy that promote equality. In this regard, paying attention more to tax policy, especially that constraint from tax policy, is important when considering solution for inequality, not necessarily in income, but also in other fields, for example, education, gender, ethnicity, and social investment, and so on. So, okay, I hope that I can keep the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. Taxation is always so technical, but so important. So that it's really great to have you as an expert on this board. We'll third turn it over to Jong-Sung You, whose video I understand doesn't work, but we should be able to hear him and we should be able to see his slides. So again, thanks so much for joining us and we look forward to your presentation. And I think, Karen, your microphone's also not on mute at the moment.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my slide?
Yes. Oh, no, not yet.
Not. It's strange. Let me try again.
Yes, now we can see it. Yeah.
You can see my slide?
Yes, maybe you can enlarge it still a bit.
Yeah. Okay. I'm Jong-Sung You. I'm very sorry. I can't show my face to you. The video doesn't work. So let me share my thoughts about rising inequality in Korea and some debate on the causes and solutions. Korea was praised as a case of East Asian miracle of growth with equity until the 1990s. So Korea's industrialization began with very low levels of inequality in land ownership and income around the 1960s, and Korea maintained low inequality with full employment and low wage differentials. However, especially after the 1997 financial crisis, Koreans felt increasing inequality. And this actually long-term trend in top 1% income share and top 10% income share shows. So during the 1970s and 80s, you see after 1990s, rise in inequality. And we also see top 1% share was quite high, very high during the 1930s and 40s when Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. So what happened between this time and this time? There is a significant land reform during the first early years of post-independence and also Korean War. So that was the story. And then also top 10% shares of wealth. Korea lies between United States and China, and higher than that of UK and France. And there are different views about the causes, especially there is a question about when inequality began to rise. After the financial crisis, especially because of post-crisis neoliberal reform of labor markets, or it began earlier due to globalization and deindustrialization, also demographic changes. And also there is a view about Korea's inequality. The market, when market income inequality rose, the welfare state can redistribute, but the small welfare state Korea's welfare state is growing, but still small. That's one thing. And the other part emphasized, it is not just the small. Korea's social security system is also dualized, not just the labor market, but the social security is dualized. So there are different views about the solutions. One, some people emphasize employment security. So regularization of non-regular workers and raising minimum wage, and there is an emphasis on universal employment insurance. So large part of workers and the self-employed are not covered by employment insurance, so expanded. And the other people emphasize the dualism in social security. And dual labor market is hard to cure, and more paradigmatic shift is required, including universal basic income and the social insurance reform from employment-based insurance to income-based, income proportional social insurance. So the previously prevailing view was Korea's rising inequality began after 1997 neoliberal reforms. But in fact, inequality began to rise in the early 1990s. And dual labor markets, deindustrialization happened before the financial crisis, and the post-financial crisis reform accelerated these trends. And the other thing is that this shows still the market income inequality. Gini is at 0.32, disposable income less than 0.3. Still relatively low, especially market income inequality is very low. But recently, the Statistics Korea is using new household survey, which better captures high-income households. And the difference between 2012 and 2007 in Gini coefficient and poverty rate, not because of a real rise in inequality, but largely because of measurement. So new household survey better captures high-income people, and so now Korea's income Gini rose substantially. Also, the relative poverty rose substantially, so close to the level of the United States. And especially elderly poverty is really high, the highest among OECD countries, and more than 3 times the OECD average. So what happened? One is the wage differentials by firm size increased enormously. And this, we see top 5 jewels assets grew relative to GDP, especially that of Samsung alone now represents more than 20% of GDP, but they hire less than 9% in manufacturing sector. And so good jobs in manufacturing sector is shrinking, and most of employment is low productivity service sector. And the dualism in social insurance, you can see only 45% of non-regular workers are covered by employment insurance, and less than 40% of non-regular workers are subscribing public pensions, employed. And especially among the non-regular who are not enrolled in employment insurance, their average wage is about $1,400 US, and so 45% of them get lower than minimum wage. So overall, 16% of wage workers get less than minimum wage, but especially non-regular workers. So this means the current government raised the minimum wage substantially, but many are not benefiting from that. Also, the self-employed small firms were adversely affected by increasing minimum wage. And only 4% of those who are not enrolled in employment insurance are enrolled in national pension. Also, they are not unionized. And I show you more than 40% of the elderly are in poverty in terms of below the median household, below 50% of the median household income. And the pension benefit, the amount of pension benefit, you see, among the 2 or more person households and single person household. I show this is income quintile, so lowest income and highest income quintile, and the public pensions, average public pension benefits per elderly. So it's about, yeah, $190 per month for fifth quintile, $2,300 per month. So you see, those elderly in the low-income households, their pension benefits are very small, and also in single-person houses, it's worse. This shows dualism in Social Security. This is largely because many of these unstable, those who are unstable workers with the low wages, yeah, they were not enrolled in national pension, or even if enrolled, they contribute a very not a long period, so their pension benefits are very small. So the basic pension helps these people somewhat, but the basic pension amount is very small. So this is the. So I am more pessimistic about this, just if Korea's welfare state grows, this will be solved. I'm pessimistic about that. Also, this employment protection and the universal employment insurance will work. I'm pessimistic. So I am more in favor of universal basic income plus fundamental reform of social insurance. The income-based toward income-based social insurance. So currently, social insurance contributions from labor income gives these incentives for employment. So social insurance contributions should be replaced by taxes from not just the labor income, but also capital income, including business profit. So the idea is basic income for the working age population and basic income for the retirees gives the minimum floor of income and the income proportional benefits when they are unemployed or when they retire. And this, there will be, everyone will be covered by income-based insurance. If income taxes are withdrawn, and so if it's not this current employment-based insurance, means a lot of people, especially with those non-regular and platform workers whose employers cannot be defined, they are excluded. So these are some of the thoughts I share, and I think this debate between universal basic income and strengthening of social insurance based on employment relations, that debate also applies to Western European countries. So I want to hear from other people. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jong-Sung. And once again, thanks to all the panelists for these input presentations. And we now switch to a discussion between the panelists as well as between the audience and the panelists. There are a number of questions already in the chat, and I will try to systematize them a bit. So maybe we start with kind of specific questions to the speakers. First, a specific question to Margarita. And then afterwards, maybe we can speak a bit longer about the solutions. So first we talk about the substance, about what we know, and then about what we could do maybe. So a first question that Leonard posed to Margarita was about the role of informal work. Basically arguing that for a long time, all the care work has been done in the households, especially by women. And so the question is whether we are underestimating this when we simply look at the growth in low-paid jobs. So looking at the growth in low-paid jobs might just make something visible that has happened for decades or centuries within the households. And so Leonard asks on your thoughts on this, Margarita.
Yes, well, I think sort of he's asking me whether, you know, since I just talked about, just gave an example of care workers, just, you know, the expansion in the number of sort of care workers in demographically sort of aged societies. And since I pointed out how they tend to be low paid, I think Len is just asking me whether I think that this is what's causing the inequality.
Yeah.
No, so it's this sort of inequality again, you know, it's really, really complex. So what's happening is, especially in the case of Japan, or I think this might just happen in other countries that are demographically old, it's just the kind of the sluggish economy where wages won't rise as high. So one sort of example is that the new jobs that are sort of expanding in sectors that do not fetch high wages. And I don't want to say sort of low pay, you know, so in the Japanese care sector or the German care sector, people who go into that sector are certified skilled people. So there is this oversight of skilled. So this is not just something that's happening in Italy where migrant care workers work in the care sector, or like the case in the United States. So there is upskilling of these jobs, but because these jobs are being paid and subsidized by the public expenditure, and because of demographic aging, it's just difficult to generate sort of enough tax revenue. So they cannot be just paid well. So does this increase inequality? In the Japanese case, I think it's the overall just downward pressure on the wages on everybody. Okay, so this is just different from sort of inequality. It's more like an advanced industrial democracy that used to be wealthy just becomes less wealthy. So the pie's shrinking. So it's a story of the pie shrinking. So what does this mean? So just many citizens feel like their life is not going to get better. And this is just one of the problems that's happening in other advanced industrial societies too. And this is why we worry about the future of democracy. So what happens when many citizens just start to feel that their life is just not getting, well, their life is just going to be worse than that of their parents. So again, just to answer sort of Len, so I'm not sort of saying that this is the source of inequality. But the growth in sort of care jobs, it's one sort of symptom of the aging society, one example of how life is not gonna get better in a society where, you know, just a country like Japan, where just nearly 10% of the population above the age of 80.
Thanks a lot. I'll continue with a second question to Junko. There are a couple of specific questions on taxation. So one was by Sean Müller, whether the revenue generating capacity doesn't depend on the different tax rates. And the second one by Jean-Luc, whether it isn't contradictory that the liberal welfare state correlates with progressive taxation, yet inequality is still on the rise. And there's a third one. I don't know if you want to try to answer 3 in a row, Junko. How can we explain the difference between party positions in tax policies and the inconsistencies with a tax policy that actually reflects their position? So there's a lot of material. Junko, do you want to pick up on some of these questions?
Okay, so I would like to answer the question from the first one. Okay, this is a very interesting question. Yeah, actually, differences between the it's okay. I do better. So wait a second. So okay, yeah, okay. Difference between the income tax and the value-added tax actually result from tax base. So in this regard, it is related to the tax exemption, but not tax rate. And actually the strengths of the BAT enable the government to raise revenue with a small change in tax rate. And probably many of you consider that, for example, the BAT has a very high tax rate in Europe. So that's the reason why it is not very much efficient. But actually, that's because of the reduced tax rate. If the European country do not implement, reduced tax rate, it is much more effective to raise revenue. So the answer is that it's related to the tax base and also tax exemption, but not tax rate. And the second question is on the sort of the very puzzling coexistence of high level of inequality and progressive tax in the liberal welfare state. And actually, this is not a contradiction if you would understand the theory and the practice of tax policy. This simply shows that it is impossible to decrease inequality only by tax. High expenditure is required. And so that's the reason why the government need a tax that can finance high expenditure. And also, we need to remember that weak revenue raising power of income tax actually result from the fact that the government cannot apply the progressive tax rate to much of higher income because of exemption. Yeah, because income tax is very vulnerable to political pressure. So it is very hard to implement. So in this regard, it's much easier to implement the tax on general consumption by imposing the flat rate on all kinds of income when they are consumed. They're used for consumption. Okay. And also actually, I got the interest question on the Japanese case. And so actually, the Japanese case is very much interest case of the indetermination. Indetermination means that actually the government, of course, shows the relatively high level of expenditure, but the government has never been ready to institutionalize tax system to finance it. So the result is a very high level of the government debt. So now, I don't know in the future I don't know how the Japanese government will solve this problem, but thus far no party have tried to raise a level of taxation on general consumption to a level, comparable level with the European country. So this means that actually it's just indetermination. So this may constrain the Japanese government in the future, but I don't know how the government will solve the problem of the budget deficit. And also I need to look at, between the party position in the policy and the inclusive. Okay, yeah, actually I showed sort of the contradiction between the existing taxation and party ideological position. But in theory, actually, there is a tax that is consistent with the ideological position of the leftist party, in theory, just in theory. Actually, tax theorists consider the expenditure tax. Expenditure tax means that impose progressive tax rate on the consumption. So to implement this system, the government need to comprehend all the consumption activity. For example, during the specific period, for example, 1 year or one financial year or something like that. Actually, in theory, it is possible, but in practice, it is impossible. So that's the reason why there is a constraint from tax policy. Even in theory, we can consider very ideal policy, for example, for the left government and for the right government. But actually, it is impossible to implement this policy. It's just in theory, actually considered by just tax theorists. So that's the reason why. Okay, I hope that I have already answered all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot. I will ask a question to Jong-Sung that Martin posted in the chat. So Martin asked how and whether there was change in the Korean welfare state, especially in Korean family policy, in the role of the family. So whether the family has become more or less important in providing welfare. And Martin would like to hear your thoughts, Jong-Sung.
The role of family in supporting the elderly people clearly declined in Korea, as in so the elderly people who doesn't have incomes more rely on government support than family, but the government support is very small. And both for the working age population and the elderly, the older population, the problem is those core workers, regular workers in large firms and the public sector, they are well protected when they are unemployed, when they retire. But those who are who have unstable jobs with low incomes, who needs most the government protection, social protection, they are not protected or very weakly protected. So that's the problem. So among the elderly, those who had good jobs in public sector or large firms, after retirement, they get good pension benefits, but the others, very low pension benefits. And another thing is Korea's family policy, supporting child care. I think it has expanded very rapidly during the last decade. So probably it's the child care support and those child allowance, it is a bit better than the support for the elderly. That's another thing. But what I want to emphasize is that generally, Korea's welfare state is still small, but actually the welfare social expenditure has been growing quite rapidly. it will grow continuously. But even if the absolute size of social spending grows, the problem of dualism in social security will not be solved. So that's the fundamental issue in Korea. And to a different degree, I also see some dualism in social security in Western welfare states. I don't know. That's not a big concern there.
Thanks a lot. Maybe we should, for the remaining 5 to 10 minutes or so, talk more about potential solutions. I think all of you, during your talks and during the answers that you just gave, sketched a couple of solutions or mentioned why particular solutions might actually not work. But maybe we can spell it out more explicitly. I think in principle, and some of the questions in the chat also go to that, in principle, there could be a couple of potential solutions. So one could be social investment, as Margarita said during her talk. But Margarita also said it might not work anymore when you have demographic aging, at least at an extreme rate. But some people like Anton Hemmerich say, especially when we have massive demographic aging, we need social investment to increase fertility and so on. A second solution might be taxation. So Junko at some point said you can only decrease inequality via taxation. And I would like to hear more thoughts on that. And Jong-Sung said a solution should be basic income, or maybe even a universal basic income, plus income insurance financed by income taxation and wealth taxation. I think in principle, there could be even more solutions. Automation could be one that is thinkable at least. Migration or immigration could be one, as Pamela mentions in the chat. So maybe immigration is a solution to some of these problems. Yeah, I think there are more, but I would just like to turn it to you to help me a bit. So maybe Margarita first. Okay,
thank you very much. So, so social investment doesn't really say much about demand or what to do with the sort of immigrants. So social investment is a supply side concept that when you just invest in good human capital, that's going to just generate or sustain economic growth. And this is not true. Say, when we just, so Japan is an example of an extreme demographic aging. Once you get there, there's no way to reverse fertility rate. It's a society that has just gone beyond the point of no return. So what happens? There's just sluggish demand, and macroeconomists are just paying attention to this, the impact of demographic aging on inflation rates, interest rates, and the growth potential. Social investment doesn't say anything about sort of demand, and also the countries that that have inspired social investment sort of strategy. These are just very, 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 very small countries, very, very small economies. Nordic economies, Netherlands, another success, just Netherlands just succeeded in adopting social investment strategy and turned itself around. And from a conservative sort of welfare state, it has just become more of a social democratic sort of political economy. But these are just very small. Like the Netherlands, in terms of population, it's roughly the size of Lombardy in Italy. What does the size mean? So size is important. And also I'll just say that the language is important. So all these sort of small economies, because they are small, they can export to other places. They're exporting services. And these are all countries that just speak Germanic languages, except for Finland. So for the residents of these sort of countries, learning English has been much easier than for Spaniards or Italians or French or Japanese to study English. So what have they done? So they just shifted to to exporting sort of services or just sort of selling sort of logistics. So they got a bit lucky in this, that because they could just, they could just rely on exports, but no one's going to complain about them because their exports will always be just relatively small to the imports of sort of big economies. Germany is just trying to do this social investment. For this, Germany, it doesn't work. It's a big country. A big country shouldn't just rely on feeling, just compensating for the sluggish demand of its own by excessively important other countries. Germany has been able to do this because it's part of the EU. Japan hasn't been able to do this because it's not part of an EU. So when it exports a lot, the US would complain, and the relationship is bilateral, whereas Germany can hide away. So there are sort of specific stuff that are just very important. So immigration, okay, so just so social investment, make women work, and also just people just say, just bring in immigrants. It just, you can't just treat foreigners in such an instrumental manner. And they want to, they have to be interested in coming. And in a country like Japan, where the wages are starting to fall, it will be just really interesting how long foreigners will just want to come in. And also just generally, even in a country like sort of Japan, so just most countries just want to have high skilled workers. Of course, they also just want to have cheap care workers, right? But it's difficult, because if you bring in low skilled people, are you gonna just say to them, you can't bring your family? Or once you just allow them to bring families, you also have to pay for the education of their children. So immigration, we already know today that immigration is very complex, and you can't just buy labor, foreign labor, and just it's not an economic issue. It's social, it's political, and in some instances, just bringing in immigrants could just cost a lot more. So this is very sort of delicate. And also there's a competition among wealthy democracies to attract more and more foreign skilled labor. So there's a bit of competition on this. A country like Italy is experiencing brain drain to other parts of Europe. So this is very delicate. But I think I've just sort of said enough about sort of my take on social investment sort of strategy as a solution to just big countries that are aging.
Yes, thanks a lot, and very clear position. Junko, what do you think? What can be done?
Yeah, actually, I think the Margarita summarized the current situation very well. But yeah, and also comparative political economy has been largely influenced by the presence of small states in Europe. And however, when I actually did the research on the history of the policy changes of the small states in Europe, at least I think it's not it is not an obvious choice. It's very intentional and a very contradictory choice. For example, small states in Europe, actually, especially Social Democratic Party, have adopted many policies that are against the leftist ideology. I think it's very intentional. I don't think it's result from the small size or the society. Probably it has been, this kind of choice was made by a small number of people, but it is very critical. And I have found a very big difference in the mindset of policymakers between, for example, in the small state in Europe and, for example, in Japan. For example, many policymakers in Japan believe that equality can be achieved efficiently. for example, by income tax or something like that. And this kind of idea actually was denied by the social democrats in the small states in Europe. I think going back to the 1950s or 60s. And also, the government, this government seems to, the social democratic government seems to believe that the promoting equality results in productivity and efficiency. This kind of idea cannot be found, for example, among the Japanese policymakers at all. They believe that the equality results in efficiency and reducing productivity. So this difference is so big for me. So it is very difficult to say that there is a special reason why the policymaker in the big economy do not understand these kind of ideas. So it's very hard for me to explain this discrepancy in policy idea between the small states in Europe and many big countries, including Japan, the big economy, including Japan. So I don't know. So if we look at the factor, socio-economic factor, it is true that the big economy actually belongs to the failure, policy failure, and the small economy have been successful. But I really do not know this result from the size of economy and also some special social characteristic of this country. So I'm not sure. So I'm sorry, I cannot answer the question, but I think it's very important to have some kind of policy idea to promote equality in the country. Okay.
Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot. Last, I will turn it to Jong-Sung, and then I'll turn it to Karen for a final word.
Okay, in Korea, there is an interesting political debate. Actually, one of the two presidential hopefuls for 2022 in the government party is promoting universal basic income. And the leader of the main opposition party is also advocating for universal basic income. So universal basic income is likely to be an important political issue ahead of presidential election in 2 years. Also, but within the ruling party, there are two ideas. The other idea is universal employment insurance and generally more employment protection and raising minimum wage, that kind of thing. So which will be Koreans' choice? That will be an interesting case. But anyway, Korea's position is unique. So Korea's welfare state is not as large as that of the Western European countries or even that of Japan. Korea's social spending is about 11% of GDP. So it is just half the average of OECD social spending, or just about 1/3 of the high social spending increase in Europe. But also the social expenditure has been increasing very rapidly. So what path Korea will take? That is a very interesting thing, I think. And secondly, so there are two different views. One is that as Korea's wealth state grows, the problem with weak protection for the non-regular workers and those precarious workers, that will growly improve over time. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is more radical restructuring of existing social security system, including basic income and the raising of taxes. That's another choice. And of course, there are also other views that see social welfare as a waste of resources, and but anti-welfarist idea is now not very popular. So the competition between the ruling party and the main opposition party will be about the choice between expansion of existing social security system or introduction of a universal basic income. So that's the current status.
Thank you so much. Karen, do you want to say a few final words?
Yes, I do. Just on behalf of the CES, I really would like to give our heartfelt thanks to Margarita, Junko, and Jong-Sung, also to for excellent moderation, and also just really excellent presentations and great questions from everybody who's listening. But I also want to emphasize that we have a sponsor in the background and a research network in the background that has helped to organize this. The Korea Inequality Research Lab has been instrumental in helping us to organize this. Also, a member of the executive board of CES, Sung-Ho Park, who's also involved in the CES Political Economy and Welfare Research Network, as is Julian as one of the co-chairs. So I just wanted to make sure that we thank them properly because they were really, really important. And also thanks to everybody for getting up early and staying up late and asking really, really great questions. So keep tuned on the CES website. We've got more coming up on very interesting topics with excellent speakers. So enjoy the rest of your morning or afternoon or evening, and we'll see you at another webinar in the future. Okay, thanks a lot.